Today on the Inquiry Zone, we talk about whether you should change the hypothesis during an investigation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week's episode of the Inquiry Zone. My name is Douglas Hunnings, and I am the Director of the Primary STEM Education here at ETHOS Innovation Center.
And I'm John Taylor, Director of STEM Education here at ETHOS Innovation Center. Glad to be with you. And Douglas, I think you've got a gem of a question today.
I do, and this is a good question, as actually it's been brought up multiple times to us from multiple buildings, and it's dealing with that word hypothesis.
Oh yeah, one of our favorites.
So here's the question. It says, okay, can you change the hypothesis as they're going through the investigation? And is there a time that it would be what they call blocked, or they're saying it's too late to change it? So this is kind of a 2-in-1. They want to know, are you allowed to change your hypothesis after you started your investigation? And is there a point in the investigation where you can't go back and change it?
Yes, it's probably one worth taking notes on today, because I do think this can be misinterpreted. What we're going to say here, we're going to try to be very clear. And it's good to talk to others too, besides just us two, but will give us our perspective on this. But you need to be very clear on this, because what I would say very quickly is changing a hypothesis. What? Yes, definitely. But I'd also just as quick as say documentation, communication is really key. So understanding here is when you have a hypothesis, the goal of science is to move that hypothesis forward. That's what we're trying to do, move it forward. If we move it forward to a conclusion, oh, we're not done, because actually the conclusion should include the next hypothesis in line with the original hypothesis. So that idea of taking some idea that you're working with, some model, which is leading to your hypothesis, and then as you go through the investigation, the hypothesis is going to be in flux, so that what is the next natural thing you're going to do? Okay, so if I'm trying to see if these red beans I have float or sink, I got all these different colors, and I go through it, and as I'm going through it, I'm thinking, maybe I should be investigating what colors float more and less. The hypothesis might change. Not the best example, but yeah. Now, what I would say is where the documentation is key is when you have a student and they get that initial hypothesis. So they're making a prediction and they're supporting it and they're connecting that together. Got a nice little hypothesis. Document it, write it down. We do not erase things in science. If anything, you run a line through it. This one you don't. You leave it there, because that's like a road mark on your trip, so people can find where you're going. And what we do, we take that road mark of that hypothesis, and then as we go through the investigation, the hypothesis might change. As that changes, we write down what's happening. That makes sense, and it's very kind of a fuzzy point. What do you think, Douglas?
It does, and because I kind of see it as, you set your initial hypothesis of what you believe is going to happen with the support, and then as you're conducting your experiment or your investigation, you may see that maybe the hypothesis wasn't as specific, or maybe you were starting to go down the path that you weren't wanting to initially, so you need to go back and revise to make it more focused on whatever you are really wanting to find out. And that's okay to go revise and just kind of tweak it to make sure it's where it needs to go. So when you do your data analysis, that's the data you collected can really support, either prove or disprove that hypothesis. And that's where I find it's okay to go back and tweak it as you continue. Now, one thing I want to put a red flag up on is where I've had this in the classroom where the students wrote their hypothesis, they did the procedures, they collected their data. They found out that their data was disproving their hypothesis. And so they wanted to go back and rewrite it so they could say their hypothesis was proven, or how they would say it, they would say it is right. Because they don't want a wrong hypothesis, because that doesn't mean that they're smart, which we know that's not true. But that's how my students were perceiving that. So if they disproved it, I want to tell them, no, that's great. That was a great hypothesis. You disproved the data. Don't go back and change your hypothesis to fit the data. That doesn't make sense. It's like you're changing your thinking based on what you collected because you want it all to come out as perfect, how they would see it.
Yeah, and this is one of those things we have to say over and over and over again. This is not about being right. In fact, the best science, I would say, the most interesting science is when everything goes wrong. That's where you discover new things. You don't discover new things in what you know. You discover, hey, you discover new things in what you don't know, which
Yes.
means when the results don't come out the way you want them to be, that's great. Now, I could see that at the younger grade levels, when we're trying to model this with our students, we're going to have experiments which are very much cut and dry. So we have we make prediction, we support it, and we've got controlled conditions so that we get a result because we're modeling with the students. And I encourage you in the younger grades to model where sometimes you don't get the results you wanted and say to the students, that's okay, look what we learned. Now, as you get older with the kids though, at that point, we really got to get this across that it's not about being right or wrong. In fact, I would say if you were right and you got a wimpy, just a very weak generic hypothesis, that doesn't carry as much weight as that student who really gets out there and it's unexpected. They've learned something new and they document it really well. That's like, wow, we've learned something new.
I was
And
going to say,
yeah, go ahead. I'm going to keep back on another point you made, which was really good, but keep going.
I was going to say, when you have your data and it disproves your hypothesis, you're going to actually learn more because you then just discovered a phenomena or something that you weren't even thinking about or expecting. Yes, it's great if you can prove your hypothesis, but remember, you just proved something that you thought was going to happen. Yes. But if you could disprove something that you thought and it was a total 180,
wow,
that's a really great learning experience.
Yeah, I guess as a teacher, you got to be comfortable with that. And that takes some experience. I will say it takes you like one time to go through that and have a positive experience like, oh, I got to do this again.
Yeah.
It just that's what we're aiming for. And the point you made earlier was about specific. I think that's the thing to think about in a hypothesis. The most interesting science is when you tend to get more and more specific. You really learn some neat things. And with our students, like the example, like I said, with the red beans, and maybe not the best example earlier, but what if you, about red beans floating and you found out that the size made a difference? So we're going deeper into our hypothesis. So we're talking not just about red beans, we eliminate a variable there in color, and then we're getting into the size, that we've learned something more. Now, I'd encourage you, if you can get your students to get into those specific, into the weeds, into those little details, what's going to happen is they'll learn how to do really cool science fair projects too. Those are the cool projects. It's not, does the salt melt the snow? It's, does the size of the crystals make a difference? Does a color, can I color them? All this, the little variables where you get into the specifics, where you take your variable and you refine it forward. That's where some real fun science happens.
That was good. I love that question. Really got us thinking, and and I encourage your guys' thoughts too. And what was your experience with that as well? Now, I do want to also say that we don't want this video to cause more stress because, I don't want you to go back to class and say, okay, now I have to make sure that all the students' hypothesis that they're very focused, and we need to see, do we need to go back? Should we go back and edit? Should we go back and revise? Don't try to do that every single time.
No,
it should be more of a natural flow, and it really should be brought up from the student's perspective. If there's a roadblock that they're hitting in their investigation, that would be a good conversation then to go back and revisit the hypothesis. One thing we talk about when we create data statements and do that data analysis is what do? You go back to your guiding question. You go back to your hypothesis to make sure your data is focused. Right. So those would be all great opportunities to really look at the hypothesis. Now, if a student goes through the whole investigation and they said it was disproven or they said it was proven, that's fine. If they don't change the hypothesis, that is okay.
Sure.
But we do want to let people know that it is all right to go back and revise, and it's not set in stone before you go on to your investigation.
Right. And we do get that word evidence, that whatever the kids come out with, I want to see the evidence. I really want to see the evidence. And, if things are really getting weird on their hypothesis, I'm discovering that we can actually jump to the moon. Okay. That I want to see the evidence, because usually the evidence leads us to understand, all right, what happened? And we can help the kids really learn to look a little deeper. And, it'll seem a little scary as a teacher sometimes, but usually once you get into it, it's not that bad. It's like, okay, we can figure it out. If not, that's interesting. Sometimes that's where we have to leave things and come back to them later, or, put the pieces together.
Yeah.
But
so great question. Thank you for the teacher that submitted that. Wonderful.
yes, awesome question. And thank you so much. If you have more questions, of course, at the bottom there, look for the contact link and please send them to us. I love to talk these through and look forward to you joining us in the future.
See you next time.
See you next time.